Sacramento, California, June 18, 1976, 4 a.m. A woman in the Rancho Cordova neighborhood of Sacramento woke to a sound, a footstep, a creak in the hallway, something that didn't belong in the pre-dawn silence of her home. Before she could fully process what she was hearing, a bright light flooded her face, a flashlight beam, blinding her, disorienting her. Then a voice, male, calm, cold. "Don't move, I have a gun. If you make a sound, I'll kill you." She couldn't see the man's face. The flashlight was too bright, but she could see his outline. Average height, athletic build, wearing a ski mask, gloved hands holding the flashlight in one hand and what appeared to be a knife in the other. The man moved closer to the bed. He pressed the blade against her throat. The cold metal against her skin was horrifyingly real. This wasn't a nightmare. This was happening. "Get up slowly," the man said. "Don't scream, don't try to run. If you cooperate, I won't hurt you." This was a lie, but she didn't know that yet. The woman complied. What choice did she have? She got out of bed slowly, her hands shaking, her mind racing. Who was this man? What did he want? How had he gotten into her house? The intruder ordered her to lie face down on the floor. He placed shoelaces, her own shoelaces that he'd apparently found earlier while prowling through her house before she woke, and tied her wrists together behind her back. Tight, painfully tight. He stacked dishes on her back, china plates from her kitchen. "If I hear these dishes move," he said, "I'll kill you." Then he left the bedroom. She could hear him moving through her house, opening drawers, ransacking cabinets, going through her belongings with methodical precision. He was in her house for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes before he came back to the bedroom. What happened next was a brutal sexual assault that lasted approximately 2 hours. The details are too graphic to describe fully, but the attack followed a pattern that would become sickeningly familiar over the next 3 years. Prolonged terror, psychological torture, threats to kill the victim if she didn't cooperate, and a methodical, almost ritualistic approach to the assault. After the rape, the intruder ate food from her refrigerator. He drank beer from her kitchen. He helped himself to her home as if he owned it. Then he untied her, threatened her one more time not to call police or he would come back and kill her, and left through a sliding glass door he'd jimmied open hours earlier. The woman waited several minutes to make sure he was really gone. Then she called police. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies responded to the call. They documented the crime scene. They collected evidence, shoelaces used as ligatures, dishes that had been stacked on the victim's back, possible fingerprints, footprints outside the sliding glass door. They interviewed the victim, who provided a description. White male, approximately 59 to 511, tall, athletic build, wearing a ski mask and gloves, spoke calmly throughout the attack, seemed organized and prepared. The deputies took the report seriously. This was clearly a violent felony, aggravated rape, burglary, kidnapping. But they had no way of knowing this was the beginning of one of the most prolific crime sprees in American history. They had no way of knowing that the man who committed this rape would go on to rape at least 50 more women and murder at least 13 people over the next 10 years. They had no way of knowing that this case would remain unsolved for 42 years. And they had no way of knowing that the rapist was someone they knew, someone they worked with, someone who wore a badge. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, and he was a cop. To understand the Golden State Killer case, we must start at the beginning. Not with Joseph DeAngelo's first confirmed crime, but with Joseph DeAngelo himself, who he was, where he came from, and how a man became capable of such evil. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945 in Bath, New York, a small town in upstate New York. He was the first of 4 children born to Joseph James DeAngelo Sr. and Kathleen Louise DeGroat. Joseph S.R., was a U.S. Army Air Corps sergeant during World War II who later worked as a civilian in the Air Force. The family moved frequently due to his military career, living in various locations including Germany and South Korea during Joseph Jr.'s childhood. By all accounts, Joseph Jr. had a relatively normal childhood, though his father was reportedly strict and demanding. Joseph Jr. was described by childhood friends as quiet, intelligent, athletic. He played sports. He did well in school. He didn't stand out as troubled or disturbed. In 1963, Joseph Jr. graduated from Folsom High School in Folsom, California, just 20 miles from Rancho Cordova, where he would later commit his first confirmed rapes. The family had moved to California several years earlier. After high school, Joseph attended Sierra College in Rocklin, California, studying criminal justice. He was interested in law enforcement as a career. He wanted to be a police officer. In 1964, Joseph joined the U.S. Navy. He served for several years, but his Navy career ended under circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious. Records suggest he may have been disciplined for misconduct, though the exact nature of this misconduct has never been publicly confirmed. After leaving the Navy, Joseph joined the U.S. Army in 1966. He served in the Vietnam War from 1968 to 1969, though records indicate he was not in a combat role. He worked as a mechanic and supply specialist. Joseph left the Army with an honorable discharge in 1969 and returned to California. He enrolled at California State University, Sacramento, where he earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice in 1972. During this time, the early 1970s, Joseph was engaged to a woman named Bonnie Caldwell. The two had met in high school and had maintained an on-and-off relationship for years. But in 1971, Bonnie broke off the engagement. She had met someone else and was planning to marry him instead. This rejection devastated Joseph. Friends later reported that he became withdrawn, angry, obsessed with Bonnie's new relationship. Some criminologists theorize that Bonnie's rejection was a triggering event that contributed to Joseph's later crimes, though this remains speculative. What we know for certain is that, after Bonnie's rejection, Joseph's life took a darker turn. In 1973, Joseph DeAngelo was hired as a police officer by the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County, California. Exeter was a small agricultural town in the San Joaquin Valley, about 200 miles south of Sacramento. Officer DeAngelo was, by most accounts, a competent but unremarkable cop. He worked the night shift. He responded to calls. He wrote reports. His supervisors described him as detail-oriented and thorough. But during his time in Exeter, from 1973 to 1976, a mysterious crime wave began in the nearby town of Visalia. The Visalia Ransacker, as the perpetrator became known, broke into more than 120 homes between April 1974 and December 1975. The pattern was distinctive. The ransacker would break into homes at night while residents were present, often while they were sleeping. He would ransack drawers and closets, but he rarely stole anything of significant value. Instead, he seemed to be looking for specific items: jewelry, coins, photographs, women's underwear. The ransacker seemed more interested in the act of invading homes than in theft. He would move through houses methodically, deliberately making noise to wake residents, then fleeing before police arrived. It was psychological terrorism. He wanted people to know he'd been in their homes, wanted them to feel violated and vulnerable. On September 11, 1975, the ransacker's activities escalated to murder. Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at College of the Sequoias in Visalia, was awakened by sounds outside his daughter's bedroom window at approximately 2:00 a.m. He went to investigate and found a masked man attempting to kidnap his 16-year-old daughter through her bedroom window. Snelling confronted the intruder. The masked man pulled out a gun and shot Snelling twice. As Snelling lay dying in his front yard, the intruder fled into the night. A Visalia police detective, William McGowan, was nearby responding to a prowler call when he heard the gunshots. McGowan gave chase and actually came face-to-face with the shooter in a nearby yard. The two men exchanged gunfire. McGowan was struck in the flashlight he was holding, which likely saved his life. The suspect escaped. McGowan described the suspect as a young white male, approximately 59, tall, athletic build, a description that matched the Visalia Ransacker. After the Snelling murder, the ransacker's activities in Visalia stopped abruptly. Investigators believe the close call with Detective McGowan had spooked him. But the crimes didn't stop, they just moved. In July 1976, 7 months after the last Visalia Ransacker incident, Joseph DeAngelo left the Exeter Police Department and was hired by the Auburn Police Department in Placer County, in the greater Sacramento area. 1 month later, in June 1976, the first East Area Rapist attack occurred in Rancho Cordova, the attack described at the beginning of this documentary. For decades, investigators didn't connect the Visalia Ransacker to the East Area Rapist. They were investigated as separate cases by different departments. It wasn't until DNA evidence became available in the 2000s that investigators realized these were the same perpetrator. Joseph DeAngelo was the Visalia Ransacker, and now, as the East Area Rapist, he was about to terrorize Sacramento in ways that would create mass panic across Northern California. Between June 1976 and July 1979, the East Area Rapist committed approximately 50 rapes in Sacramento County and surrounding areas. The true number may be higher. Some victims never reported their attacks due to shame, fear, or belief that police couldn't catch the perpetrator. The East Area Rapist had a distinctive modus operandi that remained consistent across dozens of attacks. He would select neighborhoods with single-story ranch homes, often in newly developed suburban areas with good access to drainage ditches, canals, or greenbelt areas that allowed for quick escape routes. He would prowl neighborhoods for days or weeks before selecting a target. He would learn residents' schedules, identify houses where women lived alone or where couples lived without children. He would break into homes before the attacks, sometimes days before, to unlock windows or doors for easy entry during the assault. He would also ransack homes during these pre-attack break-ins, learning the layout and sometimes taking small items as trophies. On the night of the attack, he would enter the home between midnight and 5:00 a.m. He would wake the victim by shining a flashlight in her eyes and threatening her with a knife or gun. If a couple was present, he would order the woman to tie up the man using shoelaces. Then he would retie the man himself, binding his wrists and ankles extremely tightly. He would place dishes or other items on the man's back and threaten to kill the woman if he heard the dishes move, ensuring the male victim would remain still out of fear for his partner's life. He would then take the woman to another room and rape her, often multiple times over the course of several hours. During the assault, he would sob or cry, sometimes saying things like, "I hate you, Bonnie," or "I hate you, Mom," suggesting deep-seated rage toward women who had hurt or disappointed him. After the rape, he would often eat food from the refrigerator, drink beer, ransack drawers looking for money or jewelry, and spend extensive time in the home, sometimes 2 to 4 hours total. Before leaving, he would threaten the victim, telling her he knew where she lived, that he would come back and kill her if she called police or told anyone about the attack. This pattern repeated dozens of times across Sacramento, Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and other communities in the greater Sacramento area. The psychological terror extended beyond the attacks themselves. The East Area Rapist made phone calls to his victims, sometimes days before an attack, sometimes weeks or even months afterward. He would breathe heavily into the phone. He would whisper threats. He would describe what he planned to do or what he had done. These calls traumatized victims all over again, making them feel perpetually unsafe. He also made calls to police and to people who lived in neighborhoods he was targeting. Sometimes he would call houses and ask to speak to a specific person by name, a person who didn't live there, apparently checking to see if a house was occupied before breaking in. The East Area Rapist's reign of terror created mass panic in Sacramento. Women were afraid to stay alone in their homes. Gun sales skyrocketed. Locksmiths worked overtime installing deadbolts and security systems. Neighborhood watch groups formed. People organized vigilante patrols, walking the streets at night with flashlights and weapons, hoping to catch the rapist. The Sacramento Sheriff's Department and other local agencies formed a task force dedicated to catching the East Area Rapist. They had dozens of detectives working the case. They set up surveillance in neighborhoods where attacks had occurred. They distributed composite sketches based on victim descriptions, and on several occasions when the rapist had been spotted fleeing crime scenes. But the East Area Rapist was too careful. He wore a mask. He wore gloves. He avoided leaving fingerprints. He planned extensively, and he seemed to have intimate knowledge of police procedures. He knew how long it would take for police to respond to calls. He knew surveillance patterns. He knew how to evade capture. Many investigators began to suspect the East Area Rapist might be a cop or someone with law enforcement training. This theory was controversial and wasn't publicly shared at the time, but privately, many detectives believed they were chasing one of their own. On February 2, 1978, the East Area Rapist killed for the first time in the Sacramento area. Brian and Katie Magyar, a young married couple, were walking their dog in their Rancho Cordova neighborhood around 9:00 p.m. They were less than a block from their home when they encountered a man crouching in a yard. The man stood up and pointed a gun at the couple. Brian and Katie ran. The gunman chased them and shot both of them at close range. Brian was shot twice in the chest. Katie was shot once in the head. Both died at the scene. Their dog was found sitting beside Katie's body, whimpering. Witnesses heard the gunshots and called police. Responding officers found the couple's bodies and began searching the area. They discovered a suspicious man running through yards several blocks away. Officers gave chase, but the suspect escaped by vaulting a 6-foot fence and disappearing into the night. Investigators recovered shoelaces at the scene, the same type of ligatures the East Area Rapist used. They found footprints that matched prints from East Area Rapist crime scenes, and they eventually recovered the murder weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, discarded in a nearby yard. The Magyar murders terrified Sacramento. The East Area Rapist wasn't just a rapist anymore. He was a killer, and he'd killed a couple in public on the street just blocks from their home at an hour when people were still awake and active. If he could do that, he could do anything. Nobody was safe. Despite this escalation, the East Area Rapist continued his pattern of home invasion rapes through 1978 and into 1979. But something changed in mid-1979. The attacks in Sacramento suddenly stopped. Investigators initially thought the rapist had been arrested for another crime, had moved away, or had died. Task force detectives pursued these theories but found no evidence. What they didn't know was that the East Area Rapist hadn't stopped. He just moved. He was now hunting in Southern California, and he was no longer rapping, he was killing. On December 30, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman, 44 years old, and Alexandria Manning, 35 years old, were found murdered in Dr. Offerman's condominium in Golta, near Santa Barbara. Both victims had been shot at close range while they slept. The crime scene showed evidence of ransacking. Shoelaces had been used to bind Dr. Offerman's wrists, though he'd apparently broken free and tried to fight back before being shot. The murder weapon was a .38 caliber handgun, different from the gun used in the Magyar murders, but investigators would later determine it was also owned by the same perpetrator. Santa Barbara Sheriff's detectives investigated the Offerman-Manning murders but had no suspects. The crime seemed random, a burglary that had escalated to murder when the victims woke up. On March 13, 1980, Charlene and Lyman Smith were murdered in their home in Ventura County. The crime scene was eerily similar to the Offerman-Manning murders. Both victims shot while in bed, evidence of ransacking, ligatures present. On August 19, 1980, Keith and Patris Harrington, a young newlywed couple, were murdered in their home in Dana Point, Orange County. Both were bludgeoned to death with a blunt object. Again, the crime scene showed signs of ransacking and featured the same type of ligatures. On February 5, 1981, Manuela Whitthune, 28 years old, was raped and murdered in her home in Irvine, Orange County. Her husband was out of town on business. The killer had broken in through a sliding glass door, waited for Manuela to come home, attacked her, raped her, and beat her to death. On July 27, 1981, Sherry Domingo, 35 years old, and Gregory Sanchez, 27 years old, were murdered in Golta. Sherry was raped before being murdered. Both were bludgeoned with a blunt object. On May 4, 1986, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was raped and murdered in her home in Irvine while her family was out of town. She was beaten to death with what appeared to be a pipe wrench or similar tool. These murders, 10 victims across 6 separate incidents between 1979 and 1986, occurred in different counties, were investigated by different agencies, and were not initially connected to each other or to the East Area Rapist. Southern California investigators called the perpetrator the original Night Stalker, a nickname that would later cause confusion when Richard Ramirez became known as the Night Stalker in 1985. But in the 2000s, when DNA technology advanced enough to test evidence from these old cases, investigators made a startling discovery. The DNA from the original Night Stalker murders matched the DNA from the East Area Rapist cases. They were the same person. The man who had raped 50 women in Sacramento in the 1970s was the same man who had murdered 10 people in Southern California in the early 1980s. This connected crime spree, over 120 burglaries, at least 50 rapes, and 13 murders spanning from 1974 to 1986, became known as the Golden State Killer case, named after California's nickname. And for 32 years after the last murder, the Golden State Killer's identity remained unknown. The investigation into the Golden State Killer involved dozens of detectives across multiple decades, but several individuals played particularly crucial roles. Detective Larry Crompton of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office investigated several East Area Rapist attacks in the late 1970s. After retiring, he wrote a book called Sudden Terror, documenting the case and keeping public attention focused on the unsolved crimes. Detective Richard Shelby of the Sacramento Sheriff's Department worked the original East Area Rapist cases in the 1970s and never stopped investigating. He kept detailed files, preserved evidence, and provided continuity as new detectives joined the case over the years. Detective Paul Holes of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office became the public face of the Golden State Killer investigation in the 2000s and 2010s. Holes spent 24 years working cold cases, and the Golden State Killer became his obsession. He worked tirelessly to preserve DNA evidence, to retest evidence using new technology, and to develop new investigative strategies. FBI lawyer Steve Kramer worked on the case pro bono, helping to coordinate between different agencies and pushing for new investigative approaches. But perhaps the most influential figure in the Golden State Killer case was someone who never wore a badge, Michelle McNamara. Michelle McNamara was a true crime writer and researcher who became obsessed with the Golden State Killer case in the mid-2000s. She started investigating independently, combing through old case files, interviewing victims and detectives, piecing together information from dozens of different sources. McNamara actually coined the name Golden State Killer. Before her research, the crimes were known by different names in different jurisdictions, and many people didn't realize they were all connected. McNamara wrote extensively about the case on her blog and eventually began writing a book about the Golden State Killer. She worked with Paul Holes and other investigators, sharing information and developing theories. Tragically, Michelle McNamara died suddenly in her sleep on April 21, 2016, at age 46, before finishing her book. Her death was ruled an accidental overdose of prescription medications combined with an undiagnosed heart condition. McNamara's husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, and her colleagues finished her manuscript. The book, titled I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published in February 2018. The book became a bestseller and renewed massive public interest in the Golden State Killer case. Thousands of people who had never heard of the case suddenly knew about it. Tips poured into law enforcement. The pressure to solve this decades-old mystery intensified. 2 months after the book was published, that pressure would pay off. In early 2018, investigators working on the Golden State Killer case decided to try a revolutionary new forensic technique, investigative genetic genealogy. This technique had recently been used to solve the 1987 murder of a young couple in Washington state. In that case, investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, where people upload their DNA results from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com to find relatives. The killer's DNA didn't match anyone in the database exactly, but it matched several people partially, distant cousins who shared small amounts of DNA with the killer. A genealogist named Barbara Rae-Venter then built family trees for these distant cousins, working backward through generations to find common ancestors. By mapping out these family trees and seeing where they intersected, Rae-Venter was able to identify who the killer must be based on age, location, and other factors. This technique, later called investigative genetic genealogy, was completely legal but controversial. It used DNA that people had voluntarily uploaded to public databases, but those people hadn't consented to their DNA being used for law enforcement purposes. Paul Holes and other investigators decided to try this technique for the Golden State Killer case. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch in early 2018. Within days, they had matches, distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared small amounts of DNA with the Golden State Killer. Barbara Rae-Venter began building family trees. She worked backward through generations, identifying common ancestors, mapping out entire family lines. By mid-April 2018, Rae-Venter had narrowed the suspect pool to 2 brothers who fit the age range and geographic profile, Joseph James DeAngelo and one of his siblings. Investigators began surveillance on Joseph DeAngelo, who was living in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, less than 10 miles from where he'd committed his first rapes in 1976. Investigators needed a direct DNA sample from DeAngelo to confirm he was the Golden State Killer. They couldn't simply walk up and ask for a DNA sample. That would tip him off and potentially give him a chance to flee. So they waited, they watched his house, they tracked his movements, and they collected items he'd discarded in public, trash he'd thrown away, items he'd left behind. On April 18, 2018, investigators recovered a tissue that DeAngelo had discarded in a public trash can. The tissue contained DNA. The DNA was tested and compared to the Golden State Killer's DNA from crime scenes. It was a match. After 44 years, investigators finally knew the Golden State Killer's identity. Joseph James DeAngelo, former police officer, Vietnam veteran, mechanic, husband, father, grandfather. He was 72 years old. He'd been living in the same area where he'd committed dozens of rapes in the 1970s. He'd been hiding in plain sight for 4 decades. On April 24, 2018, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert held a press conference to announce that an arrest was imminent in the Golden State Killer case. Law enforcement agencies coordinated to ensure the arrest would be safe, and that DeAngelo wouldn't have an opportunity to harm himself or others. That same day, at approximately 3:00 p.m., a team of law enforcement officers, including deputies from Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, FBI agents and detectives who had worked the case for decades, converged on Joseph DeAngelo's house at 6969 Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights. DeAngelo was outside in his driveway when officers arrived. He was wearing casual clothes, shorts and a shirt, and appeared to be doing yard work or working on a project in his garage. Officers identified themselves and ordered DeAngelo to put his hands up. DeAngelo complied without resistance. He was handcuffed and placed under arrest. Joseph James DeAngelo, an officer said, "You are under arrest for murder." DeAngelo didn't ask which murder. He didn't ask what they were talking about. He didn't protest his innocence. He simply said, "I have a roast in the oven." An officer went into the house and turned off the oven. DeAngelo was transported to Sacramento County Main Jail and booked on 2 counts of murder, the Magyar murders from 1978. Additional charges would be filed later after prosecutors reviewed evidence from all the jurisdictions where DeAngelo had committed crimes. News of the arrest spread instantly. The Golden State Killer, one of the most prolific uncaught serial offenders in American history, had finally been identified and arrested. Paul Holes, who had worked the case for 24 years and had retired just days before the arrest, was in a commercial flight when he received a text message. "We got him." Holes started crying. Decades of work, decades of frustration, decades of carrying the weight of all those victims who had never gotten justice. And now, finally, it was over. Victims and their families were notified. Some cried. Some felt relief. Some felt anger that it had taken so long. Some felt validation. They'd been telling investigators for decades that the East Area Rapist would attack again, and they'd been right. The media coverage was massive. The arrest was front-page news across the country. True crime enthusiasts who had followed the case for years couldn't believe it was finally solved. And the investigative genetic genealogy technique that had identified DeAngelo became headline news itself. This was the first time most of the public had heard about this technique, and it raised important questions about privacy, about how DNA databases should be used, about the balance between solving crimes and protecting civil liberties. These debates would continue for years, but in April 2018, most people felt only satisfaction that a monster had finally been caught. After his arrest, Joseph DeAngelo was held without bail at Sacramento County Main Jail. Over the following months, prosecutors from 6 different counties filed charges. Sacramento County charged him with the Magyar murders and multiple rapes. Santa Barbara County charged him with the Offerman Manning murders and the Domingo Sanchez murders. Ventura County charged him with the Smith murders. Orange County charged him with the Harrington murders, the Whitthune murder, and the Cruz murder. Contra Costa County charged him with multiple rapes. In total, DeAngelo faced 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. For the rapes, California law allowed rape charges to be filed as kidnapping if the statute of limitations for rape had expired, which it had for most of DeAngelo's attacks. If convicted, he faced the death penalty. DeAngelo's attorneys began negotiations with prosecutors. The case against DeAngelo was overwhelming. DNA evidence from multiple crime scenes, his own discarded DNA matching crime scene DNA, eyewitness identifications from survivors, physical evidence, everything. There was no doubt DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. The only question was whether he would go to trial or plead guilty. A trial would be lengthy, expensive, and traumatic for survivors who would have to testify. But it would also ensure DeAngelo received the death penalty if convicted. A plea deal would spare survivors the trauma of testifying, but would likely take the death penalty off the table due to DeAngelo's age. He was 74 by the time plea negotiations began in 2020, and California had a moratorium on executions. In June 2020, DeAngelo agreed to a plea deal. He would plead guilty to all 13 murders and admit to dozens of rapes and burglaries in exchange for life in prison, without possibility of parole instead of the death penalty. Many victims and their families were angry about this deal. They wanted DeAngelo to receive the death penalty. They wanted him to face the ultimate punishment for his crimes. But prosecutors argued that the plea deal was the best outcome. It guaranteed DeAngelo would die in prison. It spared survivors from having to testify. And most importantly, it would allow for an extended sentencing hearing where victims could directly address DeAngelo and make him listen to the pain he'd caused. The sentencing hearing for Joseph DeAngelo was held over 3 days, August 18th, 19th, and 20th, 2020, at California State University, Sacramento, to allow for social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic. The hearing was live-streamed, allowing victims who couldn't attend in person to watch remotely. Over the 3 days, dozens of victims, survivors, and family members gave impact statements. They spoke directly to DeAngelo, who was required to sit in the courtroom and listen. The statements were heartbreaking, powerful, and devastating. Gay Hardwick, who was raped by DeAngelo in 1978, described the 42 years she'd spent looking over her shoulder, unable to feel safe. "I now know the face and the name of the person who attacked me. I've waited over 4 decades for this moment." Chris Pedretti, also raped in 1978, described her ongoing trauma. "I was terrified. I thought I was going to die. The emotional pain never goes away." Jane Carson Sandler, raped in 1976, spoke directly to DeAngelo. "For over 40 years I've waited for this moment. I've waited to look you in the eye. I've waited to tell you how you destroyed my life." Many victims described divorces, failed relationships, inability to trust, ongoing nightmares, PTSD, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts, all stemming from DeAngelo's attacks. Family members of murder victims spoke about the loved ones they'd lost. Ron Harrington, brother of Keith Harrington, who was murdered along with his wife Patris in 1980, gave an especially powerful statement. Ron had spent 40 years searching for his brother's killer. He'd attended countless police briefings, provided DNA samples, pushed investigators to keep working the case. And now, finally, he was face to face with the man who'd murdered his brother. "When I think of him being a cop, killing my brother and sister-in-law, it sickens me to my core," Ron said. "You are a truly evil monster." Carol Dolly, daughter of murder victim Charlene Smith, described the devastation her mother's murder had caused. "I was 12 years old when you murdered my mother and stepfather. You stole my childhood. You stole my innocence." Throughout these statements, DeAngelo sat silently. He showed no emotion, no tears, no remorse, no reaction at all. He stared straight ahead, occasionally turning his head slightly but never making eye contact with the victims speaking to him. Some victims noted his lack of reaction with anger. "You're a coward. You can't even look at us." After 3 days of victim impact statements, Judge Michael Bowman addressed DeAngelo directly before imposing sentence. "Mr. DeAngelo, you deserve no mercy," Judge Bowman said. "The scope of your crimes is staggering. The pain you've caused is immeasurable. You are a monster." Judge Bowman then sentenced DeAngelo to life in prison, without possibility of parole. 11 consecutive life sentences, plus additional time for other charges. DeAngelo was immediately transported to California State Prison, Corcoran, where he would spend the rest of his life in protective custody, separate from the general prison population due to the nature of his crimes. As of 2026, Joseph DeAngelo is still alive, imprisoned at Corcoran State Prison. He is 80 years old and in declining health. He will die in prison. He will never be free. He will never hurt anyone again. The Golden State Killer case had profound and lasting impacts on multiple areas. First, it revolutionized cold case investigations. The investigative genetic genealogy technique used to identify DeAngelo has since been used to solve hundreds of other cold cases across the United States. Murders that had been unsolved for decades are now being solved using this technique. The success of the Golden State Killer case proved that no case is truly unsolved forever. As long as DNA evidence exists and is properly preserved, cases can potentially be solved decades later using new technology. This has given hope to countless families of murder victims who thought they would never get justice. It has also put uncaught killers on notice. Even if you evaded capture for decades, you can still be caught. Second, it raised important privacy concerns about DNA databases. The technique that caught DeAngelo relied on people voluntarily uploading their DNA to public databases. Those people didn't necessarily consent to their DNA being used for law enforcement purposes. This raised questions. Should police be allowed to use these databases? Should the databases themselves allow law enforcement access? What are the privacy implications of genetic genealogy? GEDmatch, the database used in the DeAngelo case, changed its policies after the arrest, requiring users to opt in if they wanted their DNA available for law enforcement searches. Other databases made similar changes. The debate over these issues continues, balancing the public good of solving violent crimes against individual privacy rights. Third, the case demonstrated the long-term psychological impact of sexual assault. Many of DeAngelo's rape victims testified about suffering for 40-plus years after their attacks. They described PTSD, nightmares, relationship difficulties, inability to feel safe, all stemming from attacks that occurred in the 1970s. This reinforced the importance of supporting sexual assault survivors, of providing long-term resources for trauma recovery, and of taking rape cases seriously even when significant time has passed. Fourth, the case highlighted failures in law enforcement communication and record-keeping. The fact that DeAngelo's crimes in different jurisdictions weren't connected for decades showed the need for better information sharing systems between agencies. If investigators in the 1970s had been able to easily compare the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and later the original Night Stalker cases, they might have identified connections earlier. Modern databases and information sharing systems make this easier, but the Golden State Killer case demonstrated why these systems are so important. Fifth, the case raised questions about police officers who commit crimes. D'Angelo was a cop during many of his attacks. He used his knowledge of police procedures to evade capture. He may have used his access to police databases to target victims or to monitor investigations. This highlighted the need for better screening, monitoring, and accountability for law enforcement officers. Finally, the Golden State Killer case became a cultural phenomenon through Michelle McNamara's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which was adapted into an HBO documentary series in 2020. The book and series brought massive attention to the case and to the concept of citizen detectives, ordinary people who use publicly available information to investigate crimes and potentially help solve them. McNamara tragically didn't live to see D'Angelo's arrest, but her work was instrumental in keeping the case in the public eye and potentially creating the pressure that led investigators to try new techniques like genetic genealogy. Her husband Patton Oswalt spoke about this at the sentencing hearing. Michelle's book helped crack the case. The attention it brought, the pressure it created, it worked. The victims of the Golden State Killer deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as people whose lives were forever changed by Joseph D'Angelo's crimes. The rape victims, at least 50 women, possibly more, lived with trauma for decades. Many didn't report their attacks due to shame or fear. Many who did report felt that police didn't take their cases seriously enough or didn't connect their attacks to other similar crimes. These women lived in fear for decades. They couldn't feel safe in their own homes. They had nightmares. Many moved away from California entirely. Hopping that distance would help them feel secure. When D'Angelo was finally arrested in 2018, many of these women came forward publicly for the first time. They gave interviews. They attended court hearings. They reclaimed their identities as survivors rather than victims. Gay Hardwick, Jane Carson Sandler, Crease Pedretti, Margaret Wardlow, and many others became the public faces of survival. They showed tremendous courage in speaking about what had happened to them. The murder victims deserve equal remembrance. Claude Snelling, 45 years old, journalism professor, shot to death protecting his daughter from kidnapping. His daughter watched him die. Brian Magyar, 21 years old, and Katie Magyar, 20 years old, young married couple, shot to death while walking their dog near their home. Their families never got to see them have children or grow old together. Robert Offerman, 44 years old, and Alexandria Manning, 35 years old. Dr. Offerman was an osteopathic doctor. Deborah Manning, Alexandria's legal name, worked as a psychologist, both shot in bed. Charlene Smith, 33 years old, and Lyman Smith, 43 years old. Charlene was an attorney. Lyman was an attorney and former Air Force officer, both beaten to death in their home, leaving behind Charlene's children from a previous marriage. Keith Harrington, 24 years old, and Patris Harrington, 27 years old, newlyweds. Keith was a medical student. Patris was a pediatric nurse, both beaten to death during their first year of marriage. Their families lost the future they would have had, the children they would have raised, the careers they would have built. Manuela Whitthune, 28 years old, raped and beaten to death while home alone. Her husband was on a business trip and came home to find her murdered. Gregory Sanchez, 27 years old, and Sherry Domingo, 35 years old. Gregory was a project manager. Sherry was an interior decorator, both beaten to death in Sherry's home. Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, high school student, raped and beaten to death while her family was out of town. She was the youngest murder victim and the last, attacked in 1986, and then DeAngelo apparently stopped killing. 13 people murdered, over 50 raped, over 120 homes burglarized, hundreds of lives destroyed when you count family members, partners, children of victims. And one man responsible for all of it, Joseph James DeAngelo. The question everyone asks about the Golden State Killer case is, why did he do it? What makes a decorated Vietnam veteran, a police officer, a husband and father, capable of such monstrous crimes? Psychiatrists and psychologists who evaluated DeAngelo after his arrest diagnosed him with various conditions, but the court ultimately found him competent to stand trial and legally sane. DeAngelo himself has never explained his crimes. He made a brief statement at his sentencing hearing, his first public words about the case. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry for everyone I've hurt." But this statement was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. Many victims felt it was insincere, that DeAngelo was only sorry he'd been caught, not sorry for what he'd done. We may never fully understand what drove Joseph DeAngelo to commit these crimes, but we can identify some factors. He experienced rejection from his fiancée Bonnie in 1971. While this doesn't excuse or explain his crimes, some psychologists theorize this may have triggered rage toward women generally. He had extensive knowledge of law enforcement procedures, which he used to evade capture. Being a cop gave him advantages other criminals didn't have. He showed clear signs of sexual sadism, deriving pleasure from the fear and suffering of his victims. This is a psychological disorder, but it doesn't absolve him of responsibility. He appeared to have narcissistic traits, believing he was smarter than investigators, taunting police and victims with phone calls, taking pride in his ability to evade capture. He compartmentalized his life effectively, maintaining a facade of normalcy while committing horrific crimes. This suggests psychopathic traits. But ultimately, trying to understand why DeAngelo did what he did may be impossible. Evil doesn't always have a rational explanation. Sometimes people make choices to hurt others simply because they want to, because they can, because they enjoy it. Joseph DeAngelo chose to terrorize California for 12 years. He chose to rape women. He chose to murder 13 people. He chose evil. And now he's paying for those choices by spending the rest of his life in a prison cell. After DeAngelo's arrest and conviction, several developments continued the story. In 2020, the FBI released information about additional crimes they believe DeAngelo may have committed. These included potential burglaries and assaults in states outside California, though none have been definitively confirmed. In 2021, investigators announced they were using genetic genealogy to investigate whether DeAngelo might be responsible for other unsolved crimes from the 1970s and 1980s. Several cold cases are being re-examined with DeAngelo as a potential suspect. The investigative genetic genealogy technique has continued to evolve. By 2026, over 500 cold cases have been solved using this method, including several high-profile murders that had been unsolved for decades. Privacy advocates have continued to push for regulations on how law enforcement can use genetic databases. Some states have passed laws governing this practice. The debate over balancing crime solving with privacy protection continues. Paul Holes, who retired shortly before DeAngelo's arrest, became a media personality, hosting crime shows and podcasts. He uses his platform to advocate for cold case investigation and for better support for survivors of violent crime. Several of D'Angelo's rape victims have become advocates for sexual assault survivors. They speak at events, work with victim advocacy organizations, and push for better resources for trauma recovery. The HBO documentary series, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, won critical acclaim and introduced millions of people to the Golden State Killer case and to Michelle McNamara's work. As of 2026, Joseph D'Angelo remains imprisoned at California State Prison, Corcoran. He is 80 years old and reportedly in poor health. He will die in prison. Some victims and family members have said they hope D'Angelo lives a long time, that he spends decades in prison thinking about what he's done. Others have said they hope he dies soon so they can finally close this chapter of their lives. There's no right way to feel. Each victim, each survivor, each family member processes this case differently. Some found closure in D'Angelo's arrest and conviction. Others say they'll never have closure, that the trauma is permanent. What's undeniable is that the Golden State Killer case changed criminal investigation forever. It proved that cold cases can be solved decades later. It demonstrated the power of DNA technology combined with traditional detective work. It showed that even the most careful, most elusive criminals can eventually be caught. And it gave hope to thousands of families of murder victims who thought they would never get answers. The Golden State Killer is one of the most significant criminal cases in American history, not just because of the number of crimes, though at least 50 rapes and 13 murders make Joseph D'Angelo one of the most prolific serial offenders ever caught, but because of what the case represents. It represents the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up even after decades without leads. It represents the courage of survivors who came forward to tell their stories despite shame and trauma. It represents the power of new technology to solve seemingly unsolvable cases. It represents the devastating long-term impact of sexual violence on survivors and their families. And it represents justice delayed but not denied. 44 years after his first confirmed crime, Joseph D'Angelo was finally held accountable. The victims and survivors of the Golden State Killer deserved better. They deserved to live in safety. They deserve to not be terrorized in their own homes. They deserve to have this case solved decades earlier than it was. But they finally got justice. Joseph D'Angelo will die in prison. He will never hurt anyone again. The Golden State Killer has been stopped. This has been Fatal Headlines. The complete story of Joseph James D'Angelo, the cop who was a serial killer, who terrorized California for 12 years, who evaded capture for 44 years, and who was finally brought to justice through revolutionary forensic genealogy. Remember the victims. Remember the survivors. Remember that their lives mattered, that their trauma was real, that their